When I resumed duty the following day, I was informed that Patrick's father had passed away at about 3 a.m. Sadly, the first thing I noticed when I entered Dr. Mark's ward was that he seemed unusually cheerful. His excitement was almost unsettling. I looked at him carefully and asked, "Why are you so happy?" "Don't I have the right to be happy?" he shot back. I think anyone in this hospital would have asked the same question, Mark," I replied, pacing slowly around the room while studying his expression. "And why is that?" he asked, sitting upright in bed. "Because I've never seen you this excited before." It did not take long for me to discover the reason behind his unusual enthusiasm. Dr. Mark was celebrating the death of Patrick's father. The revelation made my stomach turn. I hurried back to his ward, hoping to reason with him and help him understand how serious his attitude was. But did he show even the slightest sign of remorse? Of course not. That was typical of Dr. Mark. His reckless nature blinded him to the danger he was bringing upon himself. If Patrick ever found out that Dr. Mark had taken pleasure in his father's death, he wouldn't hesitate to act on his threats. A few moments later, my pager buzzed.
Oh, it's Dr. Deco.
Requesting my presence in Dr. Dinko's office. When I arrived, he was staring blankly at the office door, rhythmically tapping his fingers on the desk. As soon as he noticed me, he calmly gestured for me to take a seat. Once I was seated, he picked up a file bearing Malik's photograph. Curiously, instead of looking at the file, he fixed his eyes on me. "What's the latest on the boy?" he asked. "I don't understand," I replied, pretending not to know what he meant. "You know we can't keep him here indefinitely," he said. "Since you've rejected every option I've suggested, I suppose this has become a case of finders keepers." He ran his fingers through his hair as he waited for my response. "Thank you," I answered simply. My reply caught him completely off guard. He looked at me in surprise and slowly rose from his chair. "So, does that mean you have a plan?" "I think so," I replied, before quietly leaving his office. Although I wasn't entirely convinced my plan was practical, I decided to follow Dr. Baptista's advice. At the end of my shift, I escorted Malik to my car. He settled silently into the back seat while I took the wheel. Neither of us spoke a word as we drove home, the silence hanging heavily between us for the entire journey. Aside from the faint realization of Malik's name, he had never uttered a complete, coherent sentence to me or to anyone else, as far as I knew. He communicated almost entirely through gestures, though they were surprisingly easy to understand. Now, however, he stood motionless in the foyer, completely captivated by a 1960s Estonian grand piano. I had purchased the instrument at an auction, and despite my modest knowledge of music, had made several unsuccessful attempts to play it well. Yet here was Malik, a boy many had dismissed as stupid, running his fingers gently across the keys and hesitantly picking out a melody that sounded remarkably like the theme from The Godfather. I stood frozen in disbelief. Reluctantly, I had to interrupt his quiet fascination so I could show him the room where he would be staying and give him a brief tour of the house. He followed me without protest, but not before casting one last lingering glance at the grand piano. Once Malik had settled into his room and I retired to mine, an unsettling wave of thoughts crashed over me like a thunderbolt. What if Dr. Deco was right? What if this boy wasn't who I thought he was? What if his silence concealed something far more sinister? The possibilities spiraled through my mind. I imagined waking to an attack, or perhaps never waking at all. If that happened, Dr. Deco would undoubtedly shake his head and say, "I warned you." As for Dr. Mark, I had little doubt he would laugh all the way to my grave. Lost in these disturbing thoughts, I suddenly noticed movement coming from Malik's room. My heart lurched. Without another thought, I hurried toward the door. Better to confront whatever awaited me than die like a chicken. When I reached the room, the door was wide open. Malik was only unpacking his backpack, quietly preparing for bed. A wave of relief washed over me. Trying to hide my nervousness, I asked if he was all right. He looked up at me and gave a gentle nod. At about 4 o'clock the next morning, I awoke to the sound of a beautiful, melancholic symphony. I had never heard that composition before. The music drifted from the foyer, and, curious, I quietly got dressed and went to investigate. There sat Malik, utterly absorbed in the piece he was playing. His fingers glided effortlessly across the keys, filling the house with a melody so hauntingly beautiful that I remained still, unwilling to interrupt him. I sat beside him in silence. Without breaking his concentration, he shifted slightly on the piano bench and continued playing, as though my presence had gone unnoticed. A few moments later, the final note lingered in the air before fading into silence. Malik twitched his head, brushing the dreadlocks that had fallen across his face aside, then turned to me with a shy, closed-lip smile. Did I wake you?" he asked softly. Caught off guard, I smiled. "Of course not. I was actually enjoying it." I rose to my feet and glanced at my watch. "But I have an early morning appointment with a patient. We both need to leave the house soon, okay?" Like a machine responding to a familiar command, Malik stood immediately without a word and quietly returned to his room. In the weeks that followed, Dr. Mark's behavior became increasingly erratic and hostile, particularly toward his patients. Complaints mounted, and the management of Riola Hospital eventually ordered him to take a compulsory leave of absence. Rather than comply, Dr. Mark contacted the hospital's CEO directly. During the conversation, he alleged that the hospital had been admitting and treating non-paying patients free of charge. He specifically mentioned Malik's case, hoping it would trigger an investigation. Fortunately, he had no idea where the boy had gone after his discharge. Shortly afterward, my parents summoned me to discuss the growing controversy surrounding the hospital. During that meeting, we agreed that the only way to settle the matter was to conduct a thorough financial audit. Several days later, the investigation was completed. The auditors found no irregularities or financial discrepancies in Riola Hospital's records. With the allegations proven unfounded, and Dr. Mark's increasingly unstable and unprofessional conduct impossible to ignore, the board made its decision. Dr. Mark was relieved of his duties at Riola Hospital effective immediately. On one of my days off, I took Malik to a small eatery near my neighborhood. As we were finishing our meal, I noticed a frail-looking boy staring at us through the glass window. When I looked more closely, I realized he resembled the boy who had fled the scene on the day I first found Malik, half dead, outside the hospital. Before I could react, he disappeared in the blink of an eye. Moments later, Malik and I stepped out of the restaurant and got into my car. Just as I was about to drive away, the boy suddenly reappeared, running toward us as though desperate to catch us. I have something to tell you, miss," he said between heavy breaths. "And what is it about?" I asked cautiously. "Him," he replied, pointing at Malik. With a wave of uneasy thoughts rushing through my mind, I stepped out of the car to hear him out. "He has parents," the boy said, his eyes fixed on the half-finished bottle of cola in my hand. Relieved that his revelation was not what I had feared, I handed him the drink. He emptied it within seconds and looked at me expectantly, as though hoping for another reward. "My name is Zachariah," he added. His father was a good man, a businessman and a talented pianist. So that's where Malik's remarkable piano skills came from, I thought. Clearing my throat, I asked, "Do you know where he lives?" "Yes," Zachariah replied, "but he doesn't want to go back there anymore." He casually tossed the empty bottle aside. "His parents aren't good people." Then, stretching out his hand, he added, "Can I have some loose change? I'm hungry." The strong smell of locally brewed gin on his breath made me reluctant to hand him money, fearing it would only fuel his addiction. Instead, I bought him a hot meal from a nearby food stall before Malik and I drove away. On the way home, I asked Malik whether he knew Zachariah. He simply nodded. Several weeks later, I decided it was time to visit Malik's home with him. As we approached the house, however, I noticed an unsettling change in his behavior. The confident young man who had willingly accompanied me suddenly hid behind my back, clutching the back of my coat as though terrified. A few moments later, the front door opened. A man stood there, glanced at Malik with a mocking smirk, and then turned to me. "What do you want?" he asked coldly. "May we come in?" I replied. After a brief hesitation, he reluctantly stepped aside and allowed us inside. He dropped into a single armchair, opened another bottle of beer, and began sipping it without offering us seats. We remained standing. Not long afterward, a heavily pregnant woman emerged from one of the rooms and lowered herself onto another chair. She looked us over before turning to the man. "What do they want?"